This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking about Herman Melville with three distinguished guests. They are John Bryant, Win Kelly, both of whom are members of the Herman Melville Society, and also Jonathan Cook, an author who has written a book about that subject. And we will come back in just a moment and speak with the three of them. And we are going to be talking about Herman Melville. On your screen, you will see John Bryant, Win Kelly, and Jonathan Cook. And I made an error. Jonathan is also a member of the Melville Society. But let me let the three panelists introduce themselves, how they first were introduced to Herman Melville, and anything else they want to say about any books or websites they have. So let me start with John Bryant, since he was the first person that I actually was able to contact, and he was also one of the more well-known authors. I had actually read a couple of his books maybe about 15, 20 years ago in the late 90s. So John, if you could tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and your Melville.
Well, thank you, Dan, and it's nice to know. I have been the editor of the Melville Society since down about this time last year, and I'm currently writing a massive biography of Herman Melville. I teach at Hofstra University, and I first became aware of Herman Melville, I suppose, in two ways. I saw the 1956 John Huston Gregory Peck when I was a boy. I would have been 8 about that time. Not when it actually came out, but a couple of years after. And my mother in San Diego, California, was taking courses to get her bachelor's and eventually her master's degree at San Diego State University, which was actually, in my area, the intellectual hotbed of Southern California, you might say, 50s and early 60s. So she was reading Moby-Dick, and wow, that's a big book. And eventually
You, Win, what was your introduction to Melville?
Well, I was years old. My father was an English teacher, and I was in a hotel room, not feeling very well. He said, "Here," and he handed me Bartleby the Scrivener. I went down to dinner, and he came back later and said, "How did you like it?" And I said, "Well, it was weird. I didn't like it very much at all." That was my first encounter, and it took me a long time to come back. I teach at MIT in the literature section. I am also involved with the Melville Society and with the Melville Society Cultural Project, which has projects at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So I'm kind of involved in the outreach arm of the Melville Society and teaching and pedagogy.
You mentioned the whaling issue, and I know my wife's favorite documentary of all time is the Rick Burns documentary on about the whaling and the Melville. I think that's one of the better ones too. Have you actually like gone to places where the whaling ships went out, and like on Block Island or in that area?
Well, I've been to some of the whaling museums, and they're wonderful. Last summer, John was one of these as well. I got to sail on the Charles W. Morgan out of Mystic Seaport and experience 24 hours on the last living whaling ship. It was wonderful.
I remember going to Mystic Seaport when I was in junior high school. Jonathan Cook, let's find out about how you first were introduced to Herman Melville.
Thanks to the Library of America in the 80s. I had read Moby-Dick in high school. I think it was an abridged version. It really did not have a deep effect on me, but that is often the case in high school. But the wonderful thing about the Library of America books was that it made readers aware of the pre-Moby-Dick novels. I mean, those wonderful Polynesian novels and Redburn and Whitejacket. So I really got when I was reading, I just was amazed because Melville was just so entertaining, and the stories were really well told. So it just woke me up to the fact that Melville was not just a one-book author. And a few years later, I went to graduate school in New York at Columbia, and largely, and I wrote a dissertation published after my graduate school on The Confidence Man. And then because of the state of the job market, I adjuncted for a few years, and the last 15 years I've been teaching seniors at a private school in Northern Virginia. I've spent really most of my focus has been on Melville and religion. I published a book on Moby-Dick and the Bible 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, and several articles. A friend of mine, Brian Yothers, are now working on a collection on Melville and religion that we hope to get out in a year or two. And so I found a focus in an area that had been somewhat neglected since the really the last 30 or 40 years. And I think it's, Melville and religion has become the central focus for
pick up that thread because I want to talk about a little bit in the rest of this segment who Herman Melville was, because I know oftentimes what happens when you get a bunch of experts that you guys all know all about Herman Melville, but for a 14 or 15-year-old who's been assigned to read Bartleby the Scrivener or Moby-Dick, let's talk about who Herman Melville was. What kind of a family did he come from? I believe he was born in New York. Did he come from a religious family, lower class, upper class? What was his background? Any one of you can take that.
Well, I'll start off, but we'll pass the baton on to Wynn and Jonathan. It's a long story. He was born in 1819 in New York City, just a few steps away from the Battery, which is the southernmost end of Manhattan Island. And his father was a merchant of fine goods, which was placed them very well in the middle to upper middle class. His mother came from a distinguished family in upstate New York in Albany, the Gansevoort family. So the two coming together was quite full of promise at a very volatile time in American history, in American economic history. His father went bankrupt. At the age of 10, Melville and his family went back up to Albany to stay with the support of the Gansevoort family. And then, quite abruptly and tragically, Melville's father died in 1832 when Melville was 12 and a half. So he was effectively orphaned at that point, at a very difficult moment in anybody's life to lose a parent or a father. He spent the rest of his adolescence in Albany, and then in 1839 he went to sea for the first time to Liverpool and back on a what's called a packet ship, which was basically to deliver mail and some cotton. And he spent 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, I believe, actually, in Liverpool, walking around and sticking to the boat and so on. When he came back, which was about the time of the Amistad affair with the slavery, the slave revolt on board the Amistad, his ship actually crossed through the same waters about a month later after the Amistad was captured, and came back to Albany, became a school teacher, for a few months, went out west with a friend to Chicago and Galena, Illinois, went up and down the Mississippi River and up the Ohio River back home. And all of these experiences, the trip to Liverpool, the trip out west, all of these figure into his later works, such as Redburn and The Confidence Man, and many of the poems that he later wrote. But it wasn't until he got back from his trip out west, sort of what I call his road trip of America, he still couldn't get work. This was in the depths of the worst depression that the United States had ever experienced. We've obviously experienced, just coming out of one now. When Melville returned from his road trip around the western parts of America, he came back to an economy that was still very flat, and like many of his cousins, went whaling. He left on the Acushnet, went south down the Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and up into South Pacific, stopping off in Rio and and after 18 months, landed in the Marquesan island of Nukuhiva. And there he and a friend jumped ship, hid out in the mountains of this island, fearing presumably cannibals, and waiting for the ship to leave. They then tried to get back to the beach, but got lost and ended up in the valley of Taipei, or Taipei Vai. And there, Melville and Toby subsisted along with fairly friendly natives for what is believed to be about 3 more weeks. So for a total of 4 weeks, he was on this island. Got off the island, and by himself. His friend Toby left separately, and got on another whaling ship, which was also something of a disaster. Mutinied with a group of people. Ended up in jail in Tahiti for a while, a few weeks actually, and it's not a bad thing to be in jail in Papeete, apparently. Then hopped on another ship, ended up in Hawaii, and there joined the U.S. Navy. All of his desertions and mutinies came to a shocking end, and he was a regular sailor in the Navy. And for the following 18 months or so, he served on the U.S. United States, which was a major frigate, a man-of-war type ship, and at the top of the line, the sister ship of the USS Constitution, which you can still see in Boston Harbor, and sailed back to Boston in 1844 and reunited with his family, which was living east of Albany in a town called Lansingburg. And there is where he wrote his first book, Taipei. He was telling all kinds of stories about his experiences, many of which he had elaborated on in the year or so that he had been sailing with other sailors. So he was telling these stories on the deck and turning them into written anecdotes was fairly straightforward to him, but I don't think he fully anticipated what the whole experience of writing at this level would be. He had written pieces before and even published 2, possibly 3 pieces as an as an adolescent, but now he was a much more experienced young man of about 25, and he he was learning a lot about himself, politics, and so on as he wrote this book called Typee. Couldn't get it accepted by an American publisher. Sent it off to London with his brother, whose name was Gansevoort, named after his grandfather. And there, Gansevoort Melville was able to place the book with a highly reputable, distinguished publisher, John Murray. Murray had published the works of Byron and other great British writers, and Murray was convinced that this was excellent writing if this was written by an actual sailor. And he couldn't believe that it really was written by an actual sailor, because the assumption then, and it was a fair assumption, was that anybody who was a sailor was going to be basically illiterate. And this was not the work of an illiterate. And so plenty of people had to come to convince John Murray that, in fact, this was a real person who had written this. Melville had what's considered to be a spotty education, but that's kind of a misconception. He attended Albany Academy, which was a very distinguished school. He attended distinguished schools in New York City, but because of finances, he was in and out. So he might not have really spent more than 2 semesters at a time, and had to be pulled out and put back in different academies throughout the Albany and Lansingburgh area. But he was a great self-reader, and his brother was too. The whole family did a lot of reading and writing together, and at least I've been able to put some of this together in terms of how a person with, well, let's call it a spotty education, a kid who didn't really get his high school diploma, but nevertheless was trained in surveying and acting. He portrayed Shylock at one point in his late in his adolescent education. So he was very well read and very accomplished, and was also doing creative writing at the time. So coming from an upper middle class family down on its luck, he struggled and had a tremendous intellectual formation, despite the fact that he didn't have the standard high school diploma, or for that matter, or a college diploma, which he certainly could have achieved easily. As he put it, a whaling ship was his Yale College and Harvard, and so he, I think, was very proud of the fact of his very pronounced educational skills and literateness, having achieved it through his own experience. From Typee on, he became enormously popular, very well known, and it's with that high reputation I pass on the life story of Herman Melville to Jonathan.
So let me turn to Jonathan Cook here. Jonathan, let's talk a little bit about the interior of Melville. John had mentioned a bit about his growing up with the old Dutch family. He had mentioned the Amistad Revolt, and I had mentioned earlier the Essex. What kind of a young man on the inside was Melville? Was he devoutly religious? Was he a go-getter? Did he hold deep values, beliefs in certain things like slavery or against slavery? Or
Okay. The situation is this. Melville grew up in a family that was not particularly devout when he was a child. His mother belonged to a very well-respected Albany Dutch family who were Dutch Reform. His grandmother was fairly religious, so when they went to Albany to visit, there was probably a little more of an emphasis on religion in the household. But Melville's father was a Unitarian from Boston, so there was a strict religious regime when he was a child. Now, all of this changed when Melville's father died, or at least when they moved to Albany in 1830. His father died 2 years later. They were living in the orbit of the Gansevoorts, particularly the grandmother. So Melville really had to go to Dutch Reform church twice a day on Sunday. I mean, he had been going to church throughout his youth in Manhattan, but things got a little more severe when he was in Albany, and this continued throughout the 1830s when he was a teenager. But at the same time, as Melville grew up, I think he became much more of a religious seeker, because the doctrines of Calvinism, of course, are very harsh. Belief in predestination, original sin. The question was, if Alan Melville died, what people thought was when he was insane. I mean, his illness had affected his mental function, so his mind was rambling when he died, and there could have been a question about whether he was damned because of his condition at his death. So there were some pretty difficult feelings I think Melville had after his father's death, based on the doctrines of Calvinism. And I think this really began his whole inquiry into some of the basic tenets of Christianity, because particularly the harsher form in its Calvinist permutations, which is in the Dutch Reformed Church, in the older Congregational Church, in the Presbyterian Church. Also, I should mention this was a time called the Second Great Awakening, when Christianity was probably at its most pervasive in the United States. The religious historians consider this the peak of church membership in various denominations. I mean, the main establishment was Protestant, of course. So Melville would have been surrounded by a culture that was heavily evangelical. And during the 1830s, this was a period when there was lots of revivals, lots of his contemporaries probably having conversion experiences, lots of young men going out as missionaries around the world. So his coming of age was really contemporaneous with a very important phase of American Christianity. And he really questioned a lot of that based on his experiences, deaths in his family, death of his father. I think he started developing this very important idea of theodicy, which is, God's justice. How can you reconcile the goodness, omniscience, and power of God with the existence of evil? If your father dies, leaving your family semi-destitute, is that a sign of God's justice? Later on, his brother died, his older brother Gansevoort died as a young man. That added to his questioning. But a big influence, too, was his travels to Polynesia as a young man, a sailor going to the Pacific in his early 20s. I mean, this was a mind-bending experience, seeing these very primitive cultures living in Nukuhiva, in the Marquesas, living what seemed to be a paradisical life without Christianity. And here was, Americans and English and the French, to a certain extent, coming to convert these natives to Christianity. And Melville saw some of the worst of this attempt to convert these people as a sort of a way to open up these cultures to Western values, to Western commerce, which brought them horrible diseases, killed a lot of them off. And so that added to his doubts about certain aspects of Christianity. Now, he was not deconverted, but he became something of a skeptic in the later 1840s, early 1850s, and that the hinge of that development is really the writing of Moby-Dick, and about 1850 is really when he became really almost an agnostic, believing in a Christian moralism, I think, but having severe doubts about the overall morality of Christianity, especially in its missionary endeavors that he had seen, the worst of in the Pacific. So that takes Melville up to, the mid-century. When you want to continue.
Let me pick up with Wynne at mid-century with Melville and take him sort of towards his death. And I think he was almost an exact contemporary of Whitman. So let's talk about like the last 40 years, the Moby-Dick, and how what happened after his lack of financial and critical success with Moby-Dick.
Well, I wanted to say a little bit about the career that led up to Moby-Dick, just because I think many readers of that book think or aren't aware of how many books he wrote before then. He had by then written his Typee and Omoo, he described, and a kind of fantasy journey through a fantastic Pacific called Marty in 1848. Marty was unsuccessful, and he aimed for something a little bit more marketable with Redburn and Whitejacket, based on his Liverpool experience and his time in the Navy. But they were more helpful than he realized. I think Whitejacket in particular was a big book with a lot of layers of social history and political thought and lyrical and poetic elements too, that prepared him more for Moby-Dick than most people have perhaps recognized when they pick up the book. He wrote Moby-Dick, and it came out in 1851. After his move to the Berkshires. I'm actually speaking here from Lenox, Massachusetts, about 10 minutes from Arrowhead. Melville, the house in which Melville wrote his Moby-Dick and the succeeding books. Moby-Dick was a bit of a disappointment, partly because it was published in England and reviewed there in a form that missed some of the chapters and wasn't exactly what he had in mind. So the American reviewers picked up on those negative reviews and were puzzled, to say the least, by a book that tried to cover so many different kinds of writing and different sorts of narrative. And his a turn away from that, and we'll be talking, I think, about the Isle of the Cross and Pierre, took him to forms that were popular in the period and that allowed him to experiment in ways he hadn't before. So I like to think of the fiction of the 50s, which includes Pierre from 1852, his short stories, including Bartleby and Benito Cereno and Paradise of Bachelors, Tartarus of Maids, and culminating with two novels, Israel Potter and The Confidence Man, as giving him a chance to engage with more urban and social environments, quite different from the nautical novels that he began with, and to explore a whole range of social issues and problems across different levels of social class and location. So the 50s ended a long and quite feverish period of writing. And he had a kind of a breakdown in just about the time he finished The Confidence Man, went to Europe to recover his health, and was inspired by what he saw there to begin writing poetry, if he hadn't already begun by then. So scholars often date a kind of second career from that period when he gave up publishing prose fiction and turned to other forms. The Civil War intervened in a decisive way, and Melville, who had been trying to support himself and his family on public lectures, turned to more writing of poetry, which produced a volume of poems called Battle Pieces, based on the Civil War. Attempts to find work through to New York from Lenox, found a job in the Customs House, where he examined cargoes and signed papers, and lived for the rest of his life in Manhattan. During this time, he was writing mostly poetry. So I often tell my students that he wrote poetry for longer than he wrote fiction. And he may have written more pages, well, nearly as many pages. His long poem, Claro, published in 1876, is, I don't know if it's word for word the same length as Moby-Dick, but it certainly weighs about the same. And then later in life, after he left the Custom House, he published two small books of poems. John Marr and Other Sailors was one, and the other was called Timoleon. It was based on the travel, art, and architecture he had seen in his trip to Europe and the Holy Land in 1857. And during this time, he also began a poem about a sailor named Billy Budd that developed into a much longer prose fiction. He was working on that when he died. It was never published in a form that he had consented to. That was a posthumous publication. So what I like to impress on people is the fact that he never stopped writing. He was always experimenting. He was always engaging with new forms and finding exciting ways to expand his writing abilities and interests in the last part of his life.
And what was the critical reception of the last 25, 30 years of his prose and poetry?
Total neglect.
Total neglect?
Pretty much. He
Okay,
had a
well,
following, actually, I should say, he had a following in England of people who had, writers of nautical fiction who had read his earlier works and corresponded with him and arranged for some of the early publications of his complete works. And he was remembered in New York. It's not like he totally disappeared. He was had connections in the city, and but he didn't have any more big publications that kept him in the public eye.
okay, well, now that we've gotten a good sense of who Melville was, let's end this segment, and when we get back, let's talk about the pre-Moby-Dick prose that made him a name in his day and age, and we'll do that in just a moment. So, Bryant, let's talk about the very first writings that you had mentioned in the break there that came from Melville. Were these like diary writings? Were these, the typical writings of a teenage boy?
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize anything that Melville wrote as the typical writing. He, while he was finishing up at the Lansingburgh Academy, he was going through a very fascinating period in his life, and he actually appeared as Shylock on stage at a Christmas present, a Christmas assembly, and was orating Shakespeare. And a few at that meeting, he met a man named William Lamb, who was just about his age, but also the editor of a Lansingburgh newspaper. And I believe it was through that connection that eventually, a couple months later, appears in the Lansingburgh paper two little short stories. They're called Fragments from a Writing Desk 1 and 2. And it's quite likely that Melville had a series in mind. And these are have always been kind of neglected as mere juvenilia, and so I don't want to call it typical adolescent writing, although it clearly is very excessive and gothic and fascinating. But in one of them, he imagines himself in pursuit of a woman who leads him to another woman who is in a castle kind of chateau, and he climbs up is elevated with a basket into her room and discovers her there in a boudoir, and he tries to make love to her with passionate kissing, and kissing, and then he discovers, my God, she's dumb and deaf, And that's the end of the story with exclamation points and so on. And it's a remarkable piece of writing, but it's also a very smart piece of writing. And after he came back from Liverpool, and after having spent his first time at sea, he wrote what we think he wrote, another story, also published by William Lamb, called The Death Craft. And this is it's a dream within a dream within a dream kind of sequence. So he's doing some very if that piece in fact was by Melville, and there's a good reason to think it was, if he was actually writing in this kind of way, it was really very forward-looking and experimental adolescent writing. But we have to sort of classify it as that, even though it was published. So when Melville's brother went to John Murray to say, I have type E, and now we're moving ahead 4 or 5 years, and said, I have this book of travel, so-called travel writing called Type E, will you publish it? Murray said to Gansevoort, I can't believe that a common sailor would have written this. And he said, I can assure you that my brother has never published anything before. And that was a lie, an outright lie, which was to get his brother's book sold. Well, his brother Gansevoort, Melville's brother Gansevoort, was, after all, a diplomat. So, of course, he was lying. But the Type E was published, and in it you find a writer who is actually doing a personal narrative, and rather than a travelogue, and interspersing in between chapters of personal growth are chapters on breadfruit and Polynesian language and things like this. And he added these chapters to give it the feel of a travel book. But in his heart, Melville really wanted to write in prose romance, or what was called romance at the time. We think of romance as love stories and hot and steamy, something approaching soap opera, melodrama, or drama. But in the 1840s, romance was a kind of deep philosophical writing, kind of writing that would plunge you into unknown areas rather than stepping along on the surface of social interaction. And Type E offered him the opportunity to plunge into the native mind, or what might be called the savage mind, which he continually says he couldn't penetrate. He couldn't discover what was really going on in that mind. And I think one of the things to pick up on what Jonathan had said about his religion is that Melville and his brothers, but not his sisters, but his brothers, tend to be kind of distant from the regular trappings of religious life. That said, Melville loved to go and listen to sermons. He loved the language of it, the oratory, the reference. He was deeply involved with the Bible. And even in his earliest writings, you see the influence of biblical phrasing and biblical reference, and that kind of God hunger, I think, is there with Melville from the start. And you see it as he is hungering to know the primitive mind, the island mind, is just as much a problem of knowing nature, of knowing consciousness, of knowing God, and that is developed in his later writings. One other book that I'd like to talk about before passing the baton on to Wynne and Jonathan is Redburn. He, after writing Type E and Omu, he experimented very heavily with this kind of writing called romance, of the deeper metaphysical plunging. That was a remarkable failure, and he knew it, but he also knew that he had to get it out of his system and it's a great read. His next book was Redburn, which relates his own adolescent experiences as an adolescent, going on ship for the first time and experiencing that, experiencing Liverpool, and experiencing the return at sea as well. And in and in Redburn, you get one of the best Bildungsroman you can imagine. And yet, this book, Redburn, is rarely taught and rarely discussed. It really is the book you should be reading next if you haven't read, if you've read plenty of Melville, but you haven't read Redburn, you really should turn to it. It's exciting. It's a hoot, and it has Melville the adult writing in 1849, speaking about Melville the adolescent living on ship in Liverpool in 1839, and that adolescent in 1839 reflects back on his childhood at the age of 9, just before Melville's father, died. And so you have these different phases of manhood, boyhood, adolescence, and manhood, and they're blending and moving in and out with a voice that is reminiscent, even outdoes Dickens in some ways, is reminiscent of Twain and Huckleberry Finn. Those kinds of voices are coming through a great deal. In Redburn, he talks about what it's like to be an adolescent and to feel deeply and to feel shamelessly and to feel anger. There's one point which he actually is walking around on a steamship with his rifle, and some innocent passenger says hello to him, and he pulls up his gun and points the rifle at him, and he immediately feels the shame of his anger over the loss of his father, and the anger for his being destitute and having this crummy jacket that he's wearing. And the passengers are just horrified. And he says, they thought I was crazy, and in fact, I think I was. So I think one of the things that attracts me, to Melville is the honesty with which he brings this narrative to discuss the interior feelings of a young man and an older man reflecting on a younger man. And so it's a remarkable book, and Wynne and Jonathan can tell you more about it. They've both written this particular book, and I recommend it highly.
Okay, Wynne or Jonathan, do you want to pick up the baton?
Wynne,
I
you
think
want to go?
Jonathan's next. No, go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you for that plug for Redburn. It is a wonderful novel.
Tell us about the silver spoons.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we should say about Melville's creative talent is that most of his novels are generic hybrids. I mean, he was not bound to any one tradition. I mean, in general, we can say he wrote romances, but he was steeped in all of the major forms of fiction, you know, the Gothic, the Bildungsroman, the picaresque. I mean, he read Smollett, he loved Smollett, and, you know, Redburn really has a beautiful combination of Bildungsroman and picaresque elements that I think he was buying a lot from Frederick Marryat's Peter Simple, some of the nautical fiction that he's that his strength as a writer is to synthesize traditions in a way that is totally original. I mean, he was that was one of his problems as a writer. He was so original in the way he produced his forms. And you know, I mentioned the fact that Type E began as a travel book. Well, I mean, that was kind of a marketing gimmick. Yes, he was writing fiction from the beginning, and the other element that we should mention is that he is injecting myth into a lot of his fiction. I mean, he was steeped in the Bible, the Old Testament. I mean, the book of Genesis, the creation story was constantly in his mind in books like Moby-Dick and elsewhere. And he also was, very, very well read in Greek mythology and other mythological traditions. Like a lot of people in the 1840s in America, they were becoming aware of world religions. So it's really this rich matrix of fictional forms, mythological traditions that created the vibrancy of his fiction, and starting from Typee.
Let me turn to you and ask about the actual prose line of Melville, because before John had mentioned it, I had read Typee and Omoo after Moby-Dick, and I was a boy who grew up reading a lot of dinosaur books, and I recently interviewed a paleontologist, and I remember seeing the old like Protoceratops through Triceratops and dinosaurs, and Eohippus to modern horse, and I always had the feeling that Omoo and Typee was sort of like the early, almost like forerunners of Moby-Dick, and I had forgotten about the sort of intercalary chapters that John had mentioned about, like breadfruit and whatnot in those earlier books. In these pre-Moby-Dick works, was there an evolution, do you think, of his prose line of because it seems to me by the time I got to Moby Dick, he was much more viscous in a good sense, whereas the other prose was much more darting, much more quick, much more for the average reader. Could you speak to maybe about the evolution of his actual prose?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think he mentioned to his editor that a little practice in the art of bookcraft does wonders. I think the experience of writing gave him confidence and allowed him to take on more challenging projects. There's a lot to say about the growth of his style. I was thinking of another aspect of what you're talking about, and maybe it goes with your idea about the dinosaurs, that as he wrote, I think he became more aware of different audiences. And Jonathan's already mentioned the generic hybrids. I think those also grew out of his sense that he had multiple readers. So John mentioned that his first books were kind of written for the other sailors who had listened to his yarns on the deck at night in a watch. And when he came home, people said, those are great stories, write them up. And they might have that nimbleness that you're talking about because they were written for his friends, his family, people very close to him. And then later, as John mentioned, he spliced in these other almost little encyclopedia articles on topics in the text to give it more weight, a wider interest. But he was also thinking, as he got more experienced, about not just his market, but the other people who might be interested in his books. So I think it was Margaret Fuller, who was one of the reviewers of Typee, kind of alerted him to the fact that he had women readers. That they would have been interested in the portrayal of sexual behavior and family life that he was looking at in both Typee and Omoo. And in Marty, he had just married his wife, Elizabeth Shaw, and they apparently were reading aloud at the end of the day and closely studying books of flower symbolism. So Marty is filled with these references to flowers that speak to this world of love and romance, in the sense of love and romance, not just literary forms, and an awareness of female readers beyond his own family, and topics that included, so there's a love story embedded in Marty, and there's an intimation of a flirtation in Redburn that opened up that aspect of his audience. The other audience that I think came out of his experience of living in a growing urban center in New York City during these years was of a political and social environment that included tremendous debates over slavery, which takes a central role in Marty, and comes into White Jacket with its descriptions of flogging and punishment, very reminiscent of what people were reading in slave narratives by Frederick Douglass. And social reform movements such as temperance. That's a big topic in both Redburn and White Jacket, where there are a number of memorable drunks. And also the issues in Romantic philosophy that were influencing the way people thought about social reform and the elevation of the individual. So as his writing matured, I think also his social awareness matured, and this novel's even richer than when he began.
Could I pick up on one thing that Wynne was referring to, the social and political audiences, and also which are absolutely true. These are different audiences, and he was able to write to different audiences, and also to write in different characters, and make them distinct, just as he makes the voices distinct in Redburn. He was able to make characters distinct in, most astonishingly, in Moby-Dick. And one of the audiences that was just beginning to emerge in in America at the time was an African American audience, and we have recently discovered that one of the first African American readers of Moby-Dick wrote a brief article. His name was James McCune Smith, also a New Yorker, an African American and an abolitionist, pharmacist actually, and went to the same school, a school only a few blocks away from the grammar school that Melville attended. But when they grew up, they didn't know each other, but James McCune Smith quoted from Moby-Dick as a way of a speech by Stubb, as a way to ignite the movement toward abolition. And I bring this up because I think from the very beginning from his childhood and his growth, Melville was highly sensitive to the African American condition. New York was a slave state when he was born. Slavery was ended not until 1827. Melville's grandfather owned slaves. Melville's mother grew up, owned and sold slaves, bought and sold slaves. Melville's mother grew up with slave servants in the house, and one of those servants lived on to take care, in freedom, to take care of Melville's grandmother. And Melville's mother referred to that woman as the slave in family letters. It's astonishing. And Melville grew up with this particular orientation. There were Gansevoorts in the Albany area referred to as the black Gansevoorts. So there's even suggestions of there being relations. And when Melville died and was resurrected in his popularity in the 1920s and into the 1960s and 70s, African American readers have continually come back to Melville, not just Moby-Dick, but to Melville, because of his treatment of African American characters. Sure, he, like any writer, will use stereotypes, but the stereotypes are there only to be broken, and he breaks them significantly in very major very major African American characters who appear in in Moby-Dick and Benito Cereno and in Billy Budd. So you have a very important thread that comes from his life and into his works and throughout his works, throughout his life. And I think African American readership also began very early and was continued.
Well,
Uh,
let me just pick up on that and just end this segment by asking any of the three of you, how is Melville's treatment critically and also in terms of sales, especially in his early work, but overall in his life, different in Europe than say in America? Was he always considered a master over in Europe? You know, because there's always the idea in modern life that the French always love things American that the Americans don't appreciate. Was that similar in the mid 19th century? Was he more revered in his lifetime, say in Europe?
Well, I'll be brief because I've taken up too much time already, but he was reviewed in France early on, and very favorably. And so in the he had a reputation abroad, and of course he had a strong reputation in England. But what happened was that after Moby Dick, he published Pierre, which was a very excessive novel, a wonderful novel. Everyone should give a shot at Pierre as well. But it was a real disaster in terms of his reputation, and he returned through writing short stories, and so he was always present there. But they didn't get much translation, so it was basically a kind of Anglophone uh, world that he was writing for in the 19th century. And once the real death knell for his reputation was the publication of his poems, his Civil War poems, Battle Pieces, which was savagely reviewed because he um, often praised the enemy as well as the Union dead, and that did not sit well right after the Civil War. And it was at that point that he basically gave up his public life, and it's through those years of not writing for himself. He always had an audience in mind, but he just didn't really try to build his reputation. Um, and um, as Wynne pointed out, it was toward the end of his life, in the 1880s and 1890s, that his British readers, who were so enamored of Typee and Moby Dick in particular, um, uh, brought his reputation back, and but he just really didn't feel as an author, he just didn't feel that it was his duty to pander to audiences, and to build a reputation and to join author clubs and the Century Club. He just didn't want to do that. So after he died, he was pretty much still forgotten on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay.
And then in the around 1924, that's when Billy Budd was rediscovered. His biography was written in 1919, and that's the beginning, really, of Melville's uh, real popularity, which is it was a 20th century
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Well, we'll pick up on that as we end the show. Let's go end this segment, and when we get back, we'll talk about Moby Dick. This is Dan Schneider talking with Jonathan Cook. We're just having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to finish up this portion of the interview solo with Jonathan Cook, and then I'll bring back Wynne Kelly and John Bryant. Let's talk a little bit about your book, Jonathan. You had mentioned dealing with the idea of theodicy, which is basically man's existential dilemma with evil. Let's talk about that in Moby-Dick and his later works. So go ahead.
Yeah, I published a very thorough review in a 2012 book, and I summarized the work that had been done on Melville and religion, Melville and the Bible, and added some new sources from the Bible and some new mythical frameworks to think about that novel. My main argument is that the book of Job has a decisive influence on Moby-Dick. This is not a new argument, but I was working out the details of this connection much more thoroughly than people had in the past. And if you're not familiar with Job, it's really the premier Old Testament book that investigates the concept of theodicy, because Job is an upstanding figure. He's not depicted as a Israelite. He is a sort of a generic, upstanding fellow, and his life falls apart. His wealth is completely dissipated. His family dies. His children die. All of this is the result of a testing of his loyalty based on the figure of the Satan. This is the Old Testament Satan, who is not the New Testament devil. He's really more of an accusatory sort of a police figure in the Old Testament world. So Job loses all of his possessions, and he spends many chapters complaining that he really did nothing wrong. He doesn't see why his life has been ruined. And he engages in a series of debates with three of his friends. They're called the Comforters. But he really refuses to accept the fact that he did anything wrong. His friends are telling him that he must have done something wrong, because God wouldn't have punished him in this way. So towards the end of the book of Job, God appears as a voice from the whirlwind, and pretty much tells Job that he's just a mortal man, and he doesn't know anything about how the world works. The cosmos is a very complicated operation. Only God can regulate it, and only God can control the forces of chaos and evil in the world. One of which is a nasty sea creature called Leviathan. So anyway, Melville took the book of Job and he really adapted it to a 19th century whaling context. It was perfect for Melville's experience on whaling ships, because Leviathan is another name for the whale. So the figure of ultimate evil in Moby-Dick and the Old Testament book of Job is this figure of Leviathan. He was a monstrous sea creature, and it represents what can be called a chaos monster. In other words, the original chaotic state of the universe that is the opposite of order, which is the human world. So Melville framed this myth using Captain Ahab as a kind of a Job figure, also basing it on the Old Testament King Ahab, who was considered to be a sort of irreligious figure who was punished by God for his allowance of Canaanite religious practices into Israelite culture. So Melville's basic framework for Moby-Dick is a testing of the idea of the justice of God, and because Ahab is trying to rectify the injustice of his loss of his leg, a very painful process of having his leg amputated, and he has personified the white whale as a figure of ultimate evil, a chaos monster, and a creature that is pretty much authorized by God. And so in Moby-Dick, the figure of the whale and the Judeo-Christian deity are conflated together. So Ahab basically becomes a kind of engaged in a quest to attack God. That's the sort of religious subtext.
Well,
Yeah.
let me just ask now, with the later prose, how did some of these themes that were raised and taken to, I guess, called the highest level in Moby-Dick, how did they play out in some of the later prose? Were there echoes of this in his later prose?
Yeah. Well, it really threads the theme of Theodicy threads its way through many of his later works. I wrote extensively on the Confidence Man, which is a satirical view of America in the mid 1850s, and it's really more about social evil, what was wrong with America at the time, exposing the shortcomings of American culture. A lot of it's short fiction. Benito Cereno is the most famous example, but there's a brooding sense of fundamental injustice in the world. And going back as well to Pierre. Pierre is the novel he wrote right after Moby-Dick, and the evil in this story is the illegitimacy or the immorality of his father in producing an illegitimate child out of wedlock that shows up on his Pierre's doorstep, Isabel Banford, and his spiritual crisis and trying to decide what to do about this young woman who appears just as Pierre is about to marry a young, appropriate woman who he has been engaged to. So, his fiction really reflects these themes, either moral evil or natural evil, and his poetry as well. I mean, Clairol, his long narrative poem about a trip to the Holy Land, is a gigantic review of the state of Christianity in 1876 when it was published. It is really really an agonizing view of what can we salvage from Christianity in a post-Darwinian world. There are all kinds of religious figures in the book, lots of debates. One thing I should mention about that book and Melville's religion is that in many ways Melville really resembled more the Victorian figures who were his contemporaries in terms of his loss of faith. People like Ruskin, Tennyson, Arnold, Clough. These were really his contemporaries intellectually, because no one really in America of his generation went through the same kind of crisis of faith that Melville did. He was really ahead of everyone. I mean, he was really having the experiences that Arnold and Ruskin were having in the 1850s. And his poem, Clairol, is really a reflection of those religious doubts and difficulties that he really was very unique in experiencing as an American. I mean, people later on, like Twain, later 19th century figures had these religious doubts, but they were not quite as eloquent or at least Melville was pioneering a way to talk about religion from a position of a spiritual seeker.
Well, let me just ask you, towards the end of his life, when he had many years where he was out of the public eye and not financially successful writing, did that affect his belief in his religious belief, his belief in God in any way?
Well, it's very difficult to say where he ended his life, because he rejoined a Unitarian church that he belonged to in the late 1840s when he was married. He belonged to a church with his wife. He was newly married. That was a traditional thing to do. But in the 1880s, he rejoined, and it could be that he was like the minister. Maybe he wanted to listen to sermons, but he ended his life pretty much as a skeptic, but someone who was really unable to decide between belief and non-belief. I mean, he really could not transition to one or the other, and that is a uniquely Victorian situation for many writers who grew up with a very firm Christian faith, lost their faith, but they really couldn't give it up totally. So they were constantly rethinking about, whether they could believe or not. It's not something they can set aside, and it shows up in Melville's work right till the end. Billy Budd is filled with allegorical figures from the Bible, the clash of good and evil. Religious themes are really threading in their way right up until the end of his life.
Well,
So, that's probably about all I should say about this. And do you have any last questions?
yeah. Well, let me just give you some closing statements, and let me just let people know that they can find your website at jonathanacook.com, and they can read, learn how to order your book and whatnot. I want to thank you for your time and also for your expertise. These things happen as far as some technical issues, but
Yeah.
if you want to just say any last words on Melville, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Dan, and it's important to emphasize that Melville is a writer with huge range. He's not really a one-book author.
Yeah.
He is extremely funny in his early fiction. He is a poet and a prose writer like Thomas Hardy, who had a brilliant career as a novelist and then switched to poetry. Melville did the same. In fact, they have some eerie similarities in that respect. So for anyone who has not dipped into Melville beyond a little bit of Moby-Dick or some of his short stories, you really it's overdue to jump in right from the beginning and rediscover this great author.
Okay, well, thank you, Jonathan. And people who are interested in finding out more about Jonathan's work, there will be a link underneath this video. And when we return, we will be back talking with John Bryant and Wynne Kelly about Herman Melville. Thank you.
Thank you.